Thanks, Jim. My only fear was that if he kept doing more comedy, they'd charge a cover here.
Yeah. All right.
Glad you got over your shyness. One of the pictures that we have up here in this slide presentation is a picture where Elvis signed the wall at the Polk Theater in Lakeland in '56. And another thing that struck me about this research into Graham's life and all the other fantastic musicians who came out of this era is how Elvis just seemed to be like the Johnny Appleseed of rock and roll around here. And there were garage bands all over the place, and people like Jim and John saw themselves becoming Elvis as the path to fame and fortune. And of course, girls. Yeah. Fortunately for young teens, even at an early age, there was an important incubator out there that really gave them a leg up for their talents. They could tour regionally, get paid to play, become better live performers, thanks to what I sort of called the youth center circuit. And there were places from Auburndale to Zephyr Hills to Kissimmee to Mount Dora, Winter Haven, Daytona Beach, Orlando. This circuit may well be Florida's great unsung musical tradition. Important artists on the rise here in Polk County: Graham, Jim Stafford, Jim Carlton, John Cornell, Bobby Braddock, Carl and Jesse Chambers, Kent LaVoy, Les Dudek, and a constellation of others played the Peninsula, and great garage bands like We the People, The Dynamics, The Legends, The Starfires, The Tropics, The Outlaws, Tin House, The Purple Underground, Dwayne and Greg Allman over in the Daytona Beach. Remember them as the Escorts? The toe-headed Beatle-looking boys. Don Felder and Stephen Stills played Palatka as the Continentals. Don and Bernie Ledden were in the Mondi Quintet. Little Tommy Petty cut his teeth in Gainesville with the Sundowners and Mudcrutch. These youth centers were so hip that older teens were actually known to get fake IDs to show that they were young enough to get them. And what's also cool was in those days, locally owned radio stations, yes, at one time they were locally owned radio stations, put together their own top 40 charts. So Jim and the Purple Underground, or John and the Legends might be right up there with the Monkees or the Rolling Stones. And even before Graham was old enough to drive, his parents brought him a touring bus to go from gig to gig. In 1962, the Legends opened up for a breakout teen artist, Bruce Chanel, whose hit Hey Baby topped the charts. Anybody remember that? Few of you? Sure. Later that year in Europe, another unknown regional act, the Beatles, opened up for Bruce Chanel. And we've seen some pictures of it here. We talked a little bit about it. Also, Graham's parents bought and opened up the Dairy Down right here in downtown Winter Haven. Another great example of this youth center circuit that existed all over Central Florida. These teen acts could actually gain more regional popularity by appearing on Central Florida's version of American Bandstand, WFLA's High Time TV show. Who remembers that? Who appeared on it? Very good.
Jack Sturr was the guy.
Jack Sturr, the weatherman, was the host. Took the words right out of my mouth.
Major Kid.
The kids would get all dressed up, far more than they do today. We're talking jackets and ties. Yes, William, jackets and ties. Jesse Chambers share harmonies in the Everly Brothers' Let It Be Me. And I strongly encourage you to visit Carl's wonderful site. Again, it's DizzyRambler.com, which is, I found absolutely instrumental in my research. And I mentioned how these groups might have their own hits on the local charts. That's because there was a man named Ernie Garrison, who was a sound engineer at a church in Lakeland. Anybody remember Ernie?
Yeah.
Jim? A couple of them. Well, what he also did was he had his own sound recording service in Lakeland. And one of the fun discoveries we made was finding where Graham made his earliest record. That's one of the fun discoveries that we made. By the way, before I go any further, let me just introduce also the gentleman who took many of the great pictures in this book, Mike Robinson. Mike, would you stand up and say hi real quick? Mike did a great job in areas. He's working again today. God bless him. So talked about where Graham made that first record, and thanks to Jim Carlton sharing his collection, this is Graham's earliest acetate that I know of from 1963. And it's kind of a folky tune, kind of muddy, but it's still a great artifact to have. It was 63, I think, and
That'll be one of the tunes that we'll hear at the Dairy Down.
yeah, we'll hear a clearer version of this song, Big Country, over at the Dairy Down. And it's funny, even at this early stage, Graham had started hiring sidemen to record with him. And in the Small World department, one of the very earliest sidemen that he hired was none other than Bobby Braddock, who was doing gigs around Central Florida, already a very polished and respected musician. And to think about it for a minute, that Braddock would go on to write many great songs, including He Stopped Loving Her Today for George Jones, the man that Graham absolutely worshipped and idolized when he got into his country rock phase. So yeah, we had Big Country that was written by Jay Irwin that's on there. He was the co-owner of Caswin Music in Lakeland.
Correction. That was written by Graham. Jay Irwin just put up the money.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Thank you, Jim. But it's an example of Graham's early explorations in the folk, and right next to Caswin Music in Lakeland, a Florida Southern student by the name of Rick Norcross opened up what came to be known as the Other Room. It was a coffee house there in Lakeland. And by '63, folk had swept America with groups, some of which Jim mentioned earlier, like the Kingston Trio, the New Christie Minstrels, and the Journeymen. And Florida itself had a bunch of great folkies like Fred Neil and Vince Martin, and even David Crosby did quite a bit of time down here, Gamble Rogers. Even an unknown Joni Mitchell was discovered by Crosby at the Gaslight South Coffee House in Coconut Grove. Graham met and joined a group of 3 South Carolina folkies known as the Shilohs and performed numerous concerts. One of the group members, Paul Surratt, told me when I interviewed him for the book that the first time Graham sang with them, it was as if their 3 or 4 voices sounded like 6, 8, or 10. It was a moment frozen in time for Paul because it was just so memorable, so indelible. In fact, he told me he would pay thousands of dollars just to go back and relive that moment. And Graham had gotten so immersed in music that he didn't exactly pass his junior year at Winter Haven High. I'll put it that way. That forced his return to the Bowles School in Jacksonville, only this time it was no longer military. It was a more conventional liberal arts school, no more of the marching. And Graham actually thrived in this environment this time around. His grades came up, he was all into the acting and the music, had his own radio show. And in the summer of '64, the Shilohs visited Mecca for them at the time, Greenwich Village. And at the Night Owl, the Shilohs so impressed a young British musician that he actually sent a note up to the stage congratulating them. And the story is Graham didn't know who he was and pretty much discarded the message from Eric Burdon, who was a few months away from his smash hit House of the Rising Sun. The Shilohs also met up and stayed with a singer whose group, the Journeymen, were like mentors. In my book, Joe Kelly of the Shilohs told me about sleeping on Journeyman John Phillips' floor as he and his young wife, Michelle, were working on songs that would become Mama's and Papa's classics. The whole Forrest Gump thing again. Back at Bowles, Graham wrote a letter to one of the Shilohs' backup singers, Marilyn Garrett, about their time in the village. And thanks to Marilyn, who was kind enough to share some of her letters with me, I was able to include them in my research. This is the letter from Graham in 1964. Dearest Marilyn, January 10th. As you no doubt already know, the boys and I had a fairly successful summer. I am back at Bowles doing post-grad work for some extra credits and will probably attend either Harvard or Columbia next year. All future plans may be postponed, however, should success become a reality. And it's funny because at the time, John Phillips actually hooked up the Shilohs with Bob Dylan's manager, Albert Grossman, who was terribly impressed with this young quartet from Florida and was even ready to sign them to a contract until he found out that they were all of about 17 or 18 years old and sent them packing. And thanks to these letters that Marilyn shared with me again, it's unfiltered Graham, and you really get to see what he was thinking and feeling at the time, so it was just invaluable to have that. But tragedy struck again on Graham's graduation day from Bowles, as he found out that that very day his mother Avis passed away from cirrhosis. And of course there's been a controversy about her death that I'm sure some of you are aware of, and I examine this in detail in the book. But again, I think it's an example of how Graham hardly led this carefree life of a spoiled rich kid, as so many seem to have painted him. On the positive side, however, Graham had achieved enough in the 2 years after not passing junior year at Winter Haven High, and thanks to his academic advisor Rufus McClure up at Bowles and his stepdad Bob Parsons pulling some strings, that Graham actually gained admission to Harvard. And again, when you think about it, here is a guy who flunked out of Winter Haven High his junior year, and 2 years later he's going to the Ivy League. By the summer of '65, the Beatles had taken America. The Byrds electrified folk music with their smash Mr. Tambourine Man. Even Dylan plugged in. Graham said goodbye to the Shilohs and took off for Greenwich Village once more. Only this time, many of the musicians he'd met and hung out with headed for the West Coast. Graham realized his musical ambitions had to change. Back home that summer in Winter Haven, Graham visited his old friend Jim Stafford, who really was like an older brother to him. And Jim had been in Nashville, gone up there with John, some of the other guys to pursue their fortunes. And Jim was actually, in the book, kind enough to take us to the very living room where he sat down with Graham and they had this conversation in 1965. It was just before Graham went to Harvard, and he was just lamenting the fact that the folk just isn't working. What can I do? And Stafford went through this with me. He said, he was a little disenchanted. He was at a turning point, clearly. Stafford recalled. I just blurted it out without even thinking about it at all. I just said, why don't you let your hair grow long and do country music? And you could be, I remember telling him this now, you could be a country Beatle. You could be a country Beatle. I was thinking more of a gimmick, Stafford told me, kind of a gimmick. You know, this wasn't anything I really put a whole lot of thought into. And he said it never occurred to me that you could actually change music and do country plus rock. But Stafford said he could see a glimmer in Graham's eye from that suggestion. He perked up, and I think he liked it, is what Stafford said. You know, it was right in that period, 65, 66, that Graham made his last recordings here in Florida that Jim talked about, that became his CD, Another Side of This Life, which is wonderful because, again, it's just Graham and an acoustic guitar, and he's playing some songs he wrote, along with some other classics by people like Fred Neil. You know, it's an excellent example of what, you know, Graham was doing at the time. In this book, you'll read about Graham's journey to Harvard, and you'll see a group of never-before-published photos of his time there, taken by a photographer for Life magazine. You'll read about his time in New York, his touring days, a little bit of them back in Florida when he was with the International Submarine Band, and his move to California, where Graham recruited some early musician buddies from Florida to make the first historic country rock record, Safe at Home, by his group, the International Submarine Band. And we are fortunate enough to have one of that group here with us today. And I wonder if John Cornell would just get up and talk a little bit about making that historic record, and, you know, wondering if at the time they realized what kind of history they were making. And remember, at the time, Graham Parsons was all 20 years old. Would you welcome John?